Welcome to ChinaPower. I'm Bonnie Lin, your host, and in this podcast, we dissect critical issues underpinning China as a global power. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Victor Cha. Dr. Cha is the president of the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department and Korea chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He is also a distinguished university professor and professor of government at Georgetown University. He's also my boss. In this episode, we will discuss Xi Jinping's visit to North Korea for the first time in nearly 7 years, and just weeks after Xi hosted both Trump and Putin in Beijing. So, Victor, thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Bonnie. It's good to be on with you.
So I'd like to start with a teaser question. As you look at the recent Xi-Kim summit, what was the most surprising thing to you? Either something you saw at the summit or something you didn't see at the summit?
I don't know if there is anything surprising, but there was one thing that I thought that was significant that did not happen at the summit, which was the absence of any discussion among the leaders, reported discussion, since there was no joint statement, about a nuclear-free Korean peninsula. We've often seen that in past interactions, and I think it just speaks to where China and North Korea are currently at with regard to that particular issue.
And that relates to what we saw from the Trump administration's White House readout, which did mention denuclearization of the Korean peninsula. And it seemed to suggest that that was an issue that President Trump discussed with Xi Jinping. Do you get a sense that the absence of mentioning of any discussion of a nuclear-free Korean peninsula or denuclearization means that China's position has shifted?
It's hard to say whether it's shifted. I mean, I think the White House came out with a very strong statement about how the two leaders had discussed denuclearization of North Korea, which again, in the diplomatic parlance, that is actually a stronger position than denuclearization of the Korean peninsula. The White House kind of said that that's what they discussed. The Chinese readout of it was much more general about how they had discussed North Korea. So the fact that that North Korea came up in the Chinese readout of the Trump-Xi meeting, and Trump said that they discussed denuclearization. For there to be absolutely no mention of it anywhere in the conversation between Xi and Kim, and I think that was deliberately meant to be an omission, does at least appear to me to say that that China really has just de facto accepted North Korea's nuclear weapon status, and that they're not going to do any heavy lifting to try to change that. That doesn't mean in my mind that they would not try to help facilitate a Trump-Kim meeting, which we can certainly talk about. But I think it does mean like the heavy lifting of trying to denuclearize North Korea, as China had tried to do during the six-party talks in the mid-2000s. I don't really think that's on the agenda. And of course, China's performance or non-performance on the sanctions regime when it comes to North Korea is another indicator that they are not interested in denuclearization anymore, if they ever were.
So there's a lot that I do want to follow up with you on in terms of what you just mentioned, but I do want to take a step back and just maybe at the more basic level, can you talk us through what happened during this visit? My understanding is this was the first time she's been in North Korea since 2018, right? So
Mhm.
what has changed, and what did you see from this visit? Like, what were you watching from this visit?
So as you know, this was Xi's first overseas trip to meet with a world leader in 2026. It was after hosting a bevy of world leaders, he goes to, including Putin and Trump, he goes to North Korea. This to me was not a sign that somehow North Korea exercises undue influence, such that they could summon the Chinese president. Protocol-wise, this was a return visit for Kim Jong-un's visit to China in September. And it's also the 65th anniversary of the friendship treaty between the two sides. I would say the meeting was heavy on pageantry, light on substance. Again, the one significant outcome was the non-mention of nuclearization. The other, to me, the tangible outcome was specific reference to really trying to reopen fully trade, transport, tourism, civil aviation between the two countries that really came to a complete standstill during the COVID lockdown in North Korea. And, so I thought that was sort of the significant, tangible thing to come out of this. And I think that also spoke to perhaps, I mean, Bonnie, you could speak on this too. I mean, perhaps a little bit of a effort by China to dilute the amount of influence that Russia is now exercising on North Korea through the opening of and the promise of what looks like certainly much more trade, tourism, travel between the two sides. There is this common view that China exercises a lot of interest over North Korea because of all the trade it does with North Korea. But I would just remind listeners and viewers that although we don't have accurate numbers, um, we cannot underestimate the amount of business that's taking place between Russia and North Korea today. So two-way bilateral trade, as I understand it, between China and North Korea is around 2.7 to $3 billion right now. Um, and our estimate, and again, they're estimates because it's not like the North Koreans and the Russians are self-reporting figures. Our estimate is that at the low end, as a result of the war in Ukraine, the value of North Korea-Russia trade is now upwards of 7 to 8 billion. So really a magnitude larger than what we're used to seeing as being the most dominant relationship for North Korea, which is China. Now, of course, this is not necessarily trading in the same thing. Some of this is cash for arms, cash for troops, um, oil, all sorts of things. But still, the magnitude is quite large, and so at least in our calculation, there's a significant gap between the dominant Chinese, what is known as the dominant Chinese position, and where Russia and North Korea may be now.
I just want to correct the record really quickly. I misstated that Xi Jinping last went to North Korea in 2019. It was the Trump Kim meeting that was in 2018. So I was getting those two dates confused. And
Okay.
that's why it's been 7 years, right, since the
Okay,
last time they
that's right.
met.
Okay, we won't punish you for that. So,
But to your point, Victor, of the the growing Russian influence on North Korea and China's concern, I do think it's very interesting that Xi Jinping is going to North Korea on his first trip in 2026. And I don't really know how to make of it with Xi Jinping putting this as his first trip. Whereas if you look at last year, by this time last year, he has already taken on a dozen of other trips throughout the region.
mm,
So it does, to some extent, I don't know if it elevates North Korea's importance to China, but it does give Kim a bit more of a importance by making it Xi's first trip.
mm.
And I think that speaks to the greater leverage that North Korea has because it now has a Russia card to play and he can get from Russia what it may or may not be able to get from China. But as you look at the sequencing of these trips, right, we had the May Trump Xi meeting, then we had the Putin Xi summit. What do you think North Korea views itself as, given that it's, I guess, a third meeting for Xi Jinping in this sequence of, I don't know what you want to call it, dictators meeting with Xi Jinping? Do you think Kim views this as uh, an elevation for him, or do you think he views this as another really good opportunity because the last time Xi Jinping went to Pyongyang was 7 years ago?
Um, I think that probably from North Korea's perspective, they've gained a great deal of confidence from their position now between Russia and China. Historically, it's not been a very comfortable position for North Korea. They have always tried to get as much as they could from either side, trying to cultivate some informal competition between them, particularly during the Sino-Soviet split during the Cold War. They would see opportunities to do that. But in the current situation, I think North Korea finds themselves in a very good sort of pivot position between Putin's need for continued North Korean munitions and, in particular, troops, um, and all that comes with that for North Korea in terms of compensation, to an understanding that China um, doesn't like to fully subsidize North Korea, as we all know. They give them just enough to survive, but not enough to thrive. Um, but knowing that China still jealously guards their influence over North Korea and that they cannot be happy with the amount of influence that Russia now has. So I think that the North Koreans feel very comfortable in this position. And then to have on top of that, what I think most likely was a message that Xi Jinping carried from Trump to Kim about a willingness for the president to meet the North Korean leader. I think this now, from a North Korean perspective, puts them in a position where they have the three most important countries they need to deal with in the world: China, Russia, and North Korea, all interested in talking to the North Korean leader. Now, some people may say, like, well, they're getting trade and tourism from China, they're getting cash and fuel and who knows what else, weapons technology and other things from Russia. What could they possibly get from the United States? But I think the other thing that Kim has learned very quickly is that, we are living in a post diplomacy world where, leaders can meet. There can be lots of telegenic meetings and things and big proclamation statements. And there doesn't really need to be any follow through. You know, I mean, I'm not to be prejudiced because we have not seen all the elements of the agreement. I mean, look at this US Iran deal. I mean, the president basically said the war is over and that he's, going to focus on other things. Maybe he's going to focus on North Korea now or Cuba, but he said basically it's over. And all we have is apparently a 1.5 page memorandum of understanding that just lists the topics they need to talk about. There could be a meeting between Trump and Kim in which the bar would not be very high for either leader. Um, and Trump and Kim, most importantly, would be in a position where he has met face to face with the three leaders, and again, in North Korea's mind, they have all sat down with him as a nuclear weapons state, which is ultimately the legitimation that they are seeking, right? So in that sense, I think the North Korean leader sees themselves in a pretty good position, and um, not to like blow the minds of all your listeners, but it wouldn't be surprising to me if that Kim has in his playbook that after the United States, he's going to want to meet with the Japanese prime minister, right? To basically get all four of them to sit down with him. And again, not a lot has to be reached in terms of the proclamations in the Japan, in the Trump Kim uh, instance. All they would need to do is reaffirm the Singapore Declaration from 2018 and say, our teams will spend 120 days working on this, right? Trying to hash it out, kind of like what they're saying on Iran. Um, and then, with the Japanese prime minister, same thing. Just reaffirm the Pyongyang Declaration of 2001 or 2002, whenever it was, when Koizumi went to North Korea, and just say our teams are going to work out the details. And again, like, we're in this post diplomacy world where, like, the details don't seem to matter. And at the same time, he will have been able to sit down with all of the four leaders. So it wouldn't even surprise me if that were in Kim's playbook.
Wow, Victor, a lot to follow up on. But really quickly, from your perspective, why would want to meet the Japanese next after President Trump, not the South Koreans?
Oh, I think because the idea would be to meet with all four leaders and completely freeze out the South Koreans.
I
Completely
see.
freeze them out, because they've already stated they have no desire to interact with South Korea, that they have formally renounced the goal of unification, that South Korea is just an enemy state, and nothing else. So they would enjoy nothing more than to have had summits with Xi, Putin, Trump, and Takaichi, and not talk to the South Koreans. For them, that would be the ultimate diplomatic victory in inter-Korean relations. It's like when the South Koreans in 1990 normalized relations with the Soviet Union, and then with China in 1992. Um, the two most important patrons of their North Korean adversary. This would be the flip side of that.
Perfect. Let me follow up on what you identified as, I guess, the three main things that North Korea gained. One was you mentioned that a clear signal that China is accepting North Korea's nuclear status, more trade and tourism from China, and then again, Xi Jinping carrying a message that President Trump is willing to meet with Kim. Just on the first one, in terms of China accepting North Korea's nuclear status, do you think that signal is meant to pave a way for the United States to do the same, and that's why it's so important? Or what's the actual significance of that from your perspective?
Um, I think it's it's significant in the sense that um, North Korea had always been maybe they were not of the view of CVID, complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization of North Korea, but they were willing to accept that denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula was important. Um, that they would also be able to maintain some sort of ability to modulate or regulate the sort of behavior by North Korea. In other words, not trying to discourage North Korea from doing a seventh nuclear test, from doing ICBM tests. They had that sort of influence over North Korea. Um, but now I think they do not. They do not have that sort of influence. They do not talk about a nuclear-free Korean peninsula anymore. And as if to demonstrate how North Korea was not going to be told anything about denuclearization, as you know, Bonnie, in the run-up to President Xi's visit to Pyongyang, what did the North Koreans do? They did two things. One is they unveiled a brand new centrifuge facility where they would basically spin centrifuges to extract weapons grade, highly enriched weapons grade uranium. And then the North Korean leader's younger sister, Kim Yo Jong, I think it was the weekend before President Xi was to go to North Korea, made public statements about how North Korea would never, ever give up their nuclear weapons. And then they've made it clear that a condition for meeting with the US president is that it would not be about denuclearization. And I think they do that, one, because they believe it. I think they do it also because they're very smart and they've observed Trump and they feel if there's ever an opportunity to meet with a US leader um, without talking about denuclearization, or seemingly with the US accepting this condition to meet without talking about or without requiring denuclearization as a condition, it's with Donald Trump, because Trump gets a pass with his words. He can be in Washington, D.C. and say, I discussed denuclearization of North Korea with China, and we agree that should be what is necessary. And then he can also go to Pyongyang or wherever they meet and say, yeah, Kim, he's a nuclear weapons power. You got to admire him for that, right? I mean, Trump is the only leader that can get away with doing that. And the North Koreans, I think, certainly want to take advantage of that space.
Great. And then the second item that you mentioned in terms of what she brought to North Korea was a greater promise of trade and tourism. But you also caveated that right now the levels are lower than the levels of trade with Russia. To what extent do you see that Xi Jinping's promise could lead to a significant surge in trade and tourism between China and North Korea? Like, is there a lot of upside, or do you see that promise as more of a emphasis on better relations, but nothing really concrete following it?
Yeah, we'll have to see. Like, we'll have to see whether we do see big upticks in reported bilateral trade. We'll have to see through satellite imagery. We can probably monitor the customs area on both sides of the crossing to see how much activity there is there. Um, when the Chinese and the North Koreans meet, sometimes there is no express deliverable, but we find out later that China is building a glass factory in North Korea or something. So we could see things like that. But I would imagine that there is some sense of need on the part of China to want to increase their commercial interaction with North Korea, just because if they do the same calculations that we do, this is like a completely different level of Russia North Korea economic interaction today. The fact that um, the construction work and infrastructure that is taking place along the two land-based crossings between China, North Korea, and Russia are are accelerating dramatically, like accelerating dramatically. we're going to do our satellite imagery report this week on the opening of the new thoroughfare between Russia and North Korea. These are all reflections of how much the interaction has increased, and of course, how much influence Russia has over North Korea. When I say influence over North Korea from a U.S. perspective, that is influence in a bad sense, in that, even though the United States has complains all the time about the way that China exercises influence over North Korea relative to Russia, even though we complain about China exercising their influence, the Chinese could always be counted on not to try to discourage North Korea from really going off the rails. So like a seventh nuclear test, or a fully fueled ICBM test that's not on sort of a lofted trajectory somewhere into the Pacific Ocean near Hawaii. Like, I think like the Chinese probably do not want the North Koreans to do that, and could certainly tell them that. Um, but the danger about Russian influence and relatively less Chinese influence is I don't think the Russians care at all about any of that. They don't care if North Korea does a seventh nuclear test. They don't care if North Korea helps Iran to reconstitute their nuclear program. And they don't care if North Korea does fully fueled ICBM tests on a non-lofted trajectory. So that is what is dangerous about the a degree of influence Russia now has.
Just on the seventh nuclear test, if the signal China was sending is that they are accepting North Korea's nuclear status, do you think that that might make a seventh nuclear test from North Korea more likely in the future, or is there perhaps no desire to do that from North Korea's end if their status is legitimized diplomatically?
I mean, I feel like at this point, they are very comfortable in their position with both Russia and China. They probably don't see a need to do a seventh test. Um, and in addition to this, by not doing a seventh test, they have the United States in a very good position right now. At Trump's admitting, when Trump left Beijing, as you remember on the plane, he did a presser with the traveling press corps, and he was asked about North Korea. And what struck me was he said that Kim Jong Un, he says his normal sort of thing about how they have a good relationship and they like each other. But he said something interesting. He said, and on top of that, Kim Jong Un is showing me respect. Like, he is showing me respect. He hasn't done any testing, something to that effect. So I think the North Koreans know that if they say we're ready to meet, that Trump will meet. Or if he said, even though Prime Minister Takaichi is in very good shape right now, very strong backing and a very strong position, if the North Koreans said, like, "We're willing to meet," I bet you she'd meet, right? And so I think they feel like they're in a good position right now. If they were to do a nuclear test, that would put undue pressure on China. It would cause the US and Japan to come together even more with South Korea, call for action in the UN Security Council, put pressure on China in the UN Security Council, these sorts of things. And so I think the North Koreans have sort of gamed this all out. And so I don't really think they see a need to do a nuclear test. Announcing a new uranium enrichment facility um, to basically lock in the Chinese to not talk about denuclearization, right, in the run up to the visit. And then, like, they know Trump doesn't care. Like, all he cares about is if they do something to embarrass him, like a seventh nuclear test or an ICBM test. So they kind of know where the red lines are. And so for that reason, it would surprise me if they were to do a seventh nuclear test.
So I do want to talk a bit about the Xi's message to Kim that Trump's willing to meet. Do you think, as part of conveying that message, China may also be conveying some form of caution or their concerns about a potential Trump Kim meeting? From your perspective, what do you think would be the message that Kim actually received from the Chinese side?
So my guess is the message that basically like he met with President Trump. President Trump really wants to meet you. There are opportunities when he'll be in the region. So maybe it might be good for stability to have that sort of meeting. I think it would be something very anodyne along those lines. Um, but this is to me what's interesting about the entire situation and how much it has changed because under normal circumstances, the Chinese would be very uncomfortable with Kim Jong un and the US president meeting. In fact, as we saw in the first term of Trump, as you know well, Xi Jinping did not meet with Kim Jong un, had not met with Kim Jong un until Trump said he was willing to meet. And then Xi did what, 5 meetings with Kim Jong un? And then when the summitry failed after Hanoi between the US and North Korea, I think Xi Jinping maybe did one more meeting, but that was it. Like nothing after that. So in normal circumstances, the Chinese, would not be that excited about having a meeting between Trump and Kim again because they don't want to lose influence. They don't want a deal to be made that they're not a part of. These sorts of things. But the current situation has changed so much in the sense that China may see an interest in wanting to facilitate a Trump Kim meeting if in any small way to try to dilute the influence that Russia is now having on North Korea. And for China, and you know this better than I do, China's very happy at doing diplomacy that could benefit their interests that is costless to them, right? That doesn't require a lot of heavy lifting. So hosting the six-party talks, having the pen on all the statements that came out of there, that's heavy lifting. That was hard work. But in this case, facilitating some sort of meeting between Trump and Kim to sort of dilute Russian influence over North Korea, fairly costless to do. Russians can't really blame them for that. It might be the sort of thing that they see as useful at this particular moment, they being
And
the
just
Chinese.
and talking a little bit about what we might expect from a Trump Kim meeting, do you think that would be? I guess where would the location of that be? Would it be Singapore again? Would it be on the Korean Peninsula? And then you had mentioned you have very low expectations of that meeting, right? But is there anything? So I guess if you have low expectations of the meeting, how can it, in many ways, dilute the Russian influence? Like, what would China need to come out of the Trump Kim meeting in order to dilute the Russian influence? Like, is there any possibility that a Trump Kim meeting could lead to rollback of sanctions on North Korea, or do you think that's still very far into the future?
I think it's far into the future. I mean, the main thing, again, my guess is just to increase the levels of mistrust between Kim and Putin would be very useful. I think for the Chinese, it would be useful for the United States too. Frankly, to see more mistrust or Putin's concerns about like what are they talking about? Like what are they agreeing on? I mean, I imagine in a meeting that Trump would say something about the support that North Korea has been giving to Russia, even though he doesn't seem very committed to Ukraine. The president doesn't. I still think that they want to see something. And I would assume he'd tell them something about like, don't help Iran. Like whatever you do, don't help Iran. It wouldn't be good for you. Something along those lines. So there, and that's beneficial to the Chinese too, right? If Trump is delivering messages, delivering messages like that. For Kim, like the biggest benefit would be, again, this is not a material deliverable, but it is very important for the North Koreans to be able to meet with the US president, the Japanese prime minister, the Chinese leader, the Russian leader as a nuclear weapon state. That is extremely important to them because ever since we started doing denuclearization talks with North Korea for now 30 something years, they have always said, you have to treat us like a nuclear weapon state. We're happy to talk about arms control like two nuclear weapon states, but we don't want to talk about denuclearization. Yet the Chinese made them right in the six-party talks. And then where this meeting would happen, it's really hard to say. There was a lot of speculation when the Singapore foreign minister was in North Korea and then was in South Korea. Um, right around the time of when she and Kim met, also at a time when Allison Hooker was in the region in South Korea. The last time the Singaporean foreign minister did one of those trips was before the Singapore summit. So, there's obviously speculation about that. The the North Korean leader has constraints on where he can travel unless the Chinese lend him their airplane. Um, but who knows? Maybe the Russians are giving him airplanes. We don't know. So it could be anywhere. It could be Moscow. That would be something. Although that would kind of not be something the Chinese would like to see, I imagine. Or it could be something in North Korea. Frankly, I mean, the president last time they met at the DMZ, the president had no trouble stepping into North Korean territory. And what a media event that would be. I mean, that is the most attractive thing to the president. He just loves these, big summit meetings like between him and Xi, between him and Putin in Alaska, a big stage. And of course a Kim Trump meeting, even though this has happened before, would still garner that sort of global attention.
What about in China? You didn't mention China as an option.
I don't think the North Koreans would go for it. They really did not like meeting with us bilaterally in China. They would say, the Chinese are listening to everything that we're saying right now. When we talked about doing bilateral meetings with the North Koreans when we were in Beijing for the six-party talks, they always said, "Not here," like Europe, like any place else, not here, right? So I don't think they would do it. They would do it in China.
Thank you, Victor. So I'd like to wrap up this podcast by zooming out a little bit. So you've laid out a sequence of potential events, right? So after the Xi Kim meeting, you laid out the possibility of a Kim Trump meeting, and then potentially Kim then meeting with Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi, and in the process, freezing out the South Koreans. So, from your perspective, how might the South Koreans respond or react to this? And then zooming out even further, what about other close U.S. allies and partners, either in the Indo-Pacific or in Europe? For example, how would our European allies and partners respond to it? What are the larger geopolitical implications that you might see for our U.S. allies and partners
Yeah.
beyond Prime Minister Takaichi?
Yeah. So I mean, the first thing is that China and North Korea both are not happy with the closeness in the relationship between Japan and South Korea and US Japan South Korea relations. As you know well, like Xi went into this long demarche of Trump when they met about Japan and Japan's growing militarism and things like that. To Trump's credit, he said, like, I don't have a Japan problem. You have a North Korea problem. That's why Japan is doing this. So, I give him credit for that. And so the other thing about seeing, I'm not saying the Chinese are facilitating this, but another reason for seeing um, a Trump Kim meeting and then potentially a Kim Takaichi meeting is, and freezing out the South Koreans is from a Chinese perspective and a North Korean perspective. That might be another way to try to divide Japan and South Korea, right? Because the South Koreans would certainly feel, being the odd man out, that they are not in a good position. They may, of course, try to talk to the Japanese in advance of such a meeting, but still, it would be, especially if there was something like reaffirming the Pyongyang Declaration or something. Once they agree to these summits, they're going to want to try to accomplish something, the Japanese, and so the South Koreans might feel a little bit uncomfortable with that. And then the other thing is, I think the North Koreans are going to want to try to reconstitute their relations with Europe. The biggest cost calculation I think the North Koreans had to make, to the extent that they actually made it or thought about it, was that in their decision to help the Russians in Ukraine, they were going to lose all of their relationships in Europe. And we didn't really see the harsh effects of that because most of the European missions were already kicked out because of COVID, because of the COVID lockdown. So they and all the UN agencies were all kicked out during the lockdown. So we really didn't see the deterioration of relations between North Korea and Europe over the war in Ukraine. If there had been no lockdown, then we would have probably seen ambassadors being recalled, demarches being issued, all these sorts of things. But we didn't really see it. But this is the biggest cost for North Korea. And I don't think they value it as much as what they're getting from Russia, but they do value it in the sense that Europe was traditionally their gateway to the West. They really didn't have anything with the United States or with Japan, but they had I wouldn't say lots, but they had cultural exchanges and trade and things with the European countries. The British had their English program. The Nordic countries had a lot of NGOs operating. So there was always something there. And I think that is something that the North Koreans are going to try to reconstitute one way or the other, try to salvage one way or the other. Obviously, it's very difficult now because of the war, and because many of the Europeans have not been able to go back to North Korea. They've all been asking to go back, but they haven't been able to go back. But that's sort of on the bigger geostrategic stage. But again, the thing here is I don't think Kim's playbook is done with the relationship between Russia and China, and that I think he has much more on his agenda.
One final question before we wrap this up. So, if North Korea is in some ways recognized as a nuclear weapon state by China, by Russia, by the United States, and even by Japan, from your perspective, does that cause South Korea to definitely go nuclear and also could have trickle down effects on Japan?
So our empirical work on this finds that the primary determinant of whether South Korea would go nuclear actually has less to do with what North Korea does and has more to do with the U.S. defense commitment. So, if the United States were talking to North Korea, I don't think the current government in South Korea would necessarily have a problem with that. A progressive government in South Korea wouldn't have a problem with that. But if in some way that there were, and I don't think the South Korean government currently would have a problem with a peace regime even between Trump and Kim, because Trump is after the Nobel Peace Prize. He wants to end endless wars, and this has been, a war that never ended in 1953. Um, but I think if it were coupled with some sort of tangible decrease in the U.S. security commitment to South Korea, then things could change. Um, And then all of our data work, as you know, Christy Gavella and I have been doing some work on Japanese and South Korean attitudes towards going nuclear. If that were to happen, where the U.S. would somehow cut its commitment to South Korea as a part of a North Korea deal that pushed South Korea to going nuclear, Japan is likely to react to that. Like our surveys show that Japan is more likely to react to South Korea going nuclear than to more North Korean nuclear proliferation or even China's nuclear buildup. That South Korea actually is much more of a trigger. So that could be one possible way we would get dominoes.
Well, thank you so much, Victor, for those wide ranging conversations started by the Xi Kim summit, but really covering quite a bit of regional dynamics and the implications of how this summit fits into China, Russia, North Korea, Iran relations, as well as how it fits into President Trump's engagements with the regions at large and North Korea's relations with South Korea and Japan. Thank you so much for joining my podcast.
Thank you, Bonnie. Pleasure to be on with you.